Hello everyone and welcome to Skeptics in the Pub online. Tonight's event is hosted by us, a collective group of Skeptics in the Pub organisers who wanted to provide a weekly social and engaging alternative to in-person events during the pandemic. If you've never heard of Skepticism before, the goal of Skepticism is to try and apply some critical thinking to all sorts of aspects of the world and our lives, which is especially important during times like the ones we find ourselves in now. You know, we want to be sure we're making decisions on how to keep ourselves safe during the pandemic based on evidence and reliable information from reliable sources. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'll just let you know how tonight's going to work. First, if you're using the Twitch stream on a computer, phone or tablet device, you can join in the chat, which you'll see down the side or underneath. Use that space to chat to the rest of the audience, say hello, let us know where you're watching from and what you're drinking. Our speaker will talk for between 45 minutes and an hour, and then we'll have a short break for you to refresh your drinks, stretch your legs and use the bathroom. During the talk, you can head to slide.do/Kavin to ask questions and upvote the questions that you want to see answered. The link will be shared on the screen and in the chat at regular intervals. And you can also go to our PayPal to make a donation if you like what we're doing, and the link for that will also be on your screen and in the chat too. After the break, we'll bring back our speaker and ask her as many of your questions that we can get through in a reasonable time. We'll try and prioritise those that have been upvoted, so do vote for your favourites. And this week, our speaker's indicated that she'd like to join us for a chat after the event. So join us in our Zoom pub later on, the Lock-in's Razor, to chat, relax, socialise and chat to Kavin. The link will be shared in the chat box later on. Moderators will be available in the chat for the whole event. There'll be organisers in the Zoom chat and after the event. And if you have any problems you'd like to discuss privately, you can email us at skeptics.online@gmail.com. And if you experience any form of harassment, bullying or interactions that make you feel uncomfortable, do let us know. As I said before, we're running weekly events, so join us next week for Bryce Blankenagel, who'll be talking to us about Mormonism and eugenics. But this week, let me introduce our speaker for tonight, Kavin Senapathy. Kavin is a writer, a journalist, and a speaker on science, health, food, and parenting for a whole range of outlets, including Slate, Forbes, SciShow, and Undark magazine. She co-founded SciMoms.com and has been part of the skeptical movement for 9 years. Today, she's going to talk to us about her experience with one of the bigger American skeptical organizations, what she learned from that, and how we as skeptics can learn from that too. So without further ado, please fill the chat with claps and welcome our speaker tonight, Kavin Senapathy.
All right. Thank you so much to the Skeptics in the Pub online team for inviting me to speak today. I'm coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin, which is in the Midwestern United States. You might be familiar with it. Otherwise, it's about 2 hours north of Chicago, if that means anything to you. And today I am drinking a Diet Coke out of my SciMoms mug. So I look forward to hearing what everyone else is having. There aren't a whole lot of silver linings to the COVID crisis. So if anything, opportunities like this to connect with each other without registering for a conference and booking a flight is quite nice. So let's get to it. I have the utmost confidence in the tech skills of the folks behind the scenes, and I've been promised that I'll be alerted immediately if something goes wrong on my end. But it is new for me to give a talk and not receive any live audience feedback. But I think that those of us who regularly do any sort of public speaking might as well get used to it. So here I go. When Alice invited me, I initially thought I'd give my talk on the overblown breast is best mantra, which I presented at SciCon in 2019. And I figured that you can see it on YouTube. I also considered doing my talk on vaccines and the misinformation hydra, which I was to present in Rome at the Aspen Global Conference on Scientific Thinking and Action in April of this year. But of course that didn't happen, and it's not happening for a while. So I decided to go ahead and do this talk at this year's Secular Student Alliance virtual conference, which is at the end of this month, actually now. And it's great because you're all invited and it's free to attend. And there are quite a good lineup of speakers. So in a nutshell, that talk is going to be about the science and the science communication around vaccines and why people who call themselves science communicators regularly describe their jobs as a game of whack-a-mole. So anyhow, when Alice mentioned that there was interest among skeptics about my experience with CFI and CSI, I thought that this is a core lesson for skeptics. It's hugely relevant to skepticism, and it's integral to the anti-vaccine movement, alternative medicine, and so many other issues that skeptics tend to be interested in. So I've been studying the roles of communication and social injustice and inequality in the spheres of science, health, food, and chemical exposure, among other things, for the past handful of years. And at the same time, I've gleaned observations from my experiences with organizations and individuals in positions of power within those spheres. So naturally, I write about these experiences. I know some of you who have been following me for a while know my history with the entity that is GMO. And I put that in quotes for a whole lot of reasons that I can't possibly get into today. And also the polarization around that entity, which is a behemoth of a thing, really, and it's one that I'll be covering in more detail in an upcoming project. But you can read this essay at Undark, and also the Slate essay that led to that Undark story if you like. I've linked them in the slides here, and I think that the Skeptics in the Pub online team will be making those available to you as a PDF, actually. So the focus of today's talk is about skeptics and white supremacy, and Undark was also the right place for this essay on CFI and CSI and why the skeptics movement can't afford to ignore racial inequality. So I'll get to that in a few minutes, but first I'll explain some of the backstory. This will be a bit US-centric, and as a born and raised American, I'm just going to go ahead and apologize for us. But also, I guess we gave you Beyonce, so does that make up for some of it? I guess you can let me know. Zoom later. But really, I hope you'll see the relevance to the UK and to the global skeptical scene also. I really do think that the lessons that I'm going to share here today are universal. I also want to state up front that I know many of you in the audience today have been yelling about racism and other pseudoscientific bigotry in the skeptics movement, including people who have formerly been through the ringer with CFI, CSI, and its leadership. Some of you have understandably washed your hands of them, and others are still doing the work on the inside. And I want to make clear that I see you and that I appreciate you. You're all over the world and in the United States. There are plenty of great skeptics here, and a few of you are my friends and my colleagues, and I'm sure several of you are here today, so a special toast. So while I'll talk about some data in general, this isn't a talk about the peer-reviewed literature on race and racism and white supremacy. And it's not about the peer-reviewed literature on marginalized communities. Data and facts are, of course, important when it comes to white supremacy, and it's certainly of utmost importance. It is for me, especially when I'm doing straight-up science writing. But I really think that over-intellectualization, allows people to take the humanity and suffering of real human people out of the dialogue. And that's not how I roll for a talk like this one. At the same time, I don't purport to speak for people of color on the whole. I'm still learning myself, and I'm never done learning, and I can only speak from my own perspective. And while I'm going to be critical in my analysis of CFI and CSI, I highly respect several of the people still involved with the organization. And as for the Skeptics movement, it's been really encouraging to see such well-rounded skeptical people and organizations doing their part around the world, in the US and globally. And I'm proud to be part of some of that work. So we will dive right into the lessons that skeptics can take from the Center for Inquiry and the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry in just a moment. So first, a quick overview of how I got into the skeptics movement. This is me and my dad, and I'm poking a little bit of fun, but he's a great dad and grandfather as well. But so certain folks, you know them, the kind of guys who love logic, but they're really engaging in no such thing. They often come at me with all of the trappings of calm, rational discourse, suggesting that I should stick to writing about science rather than air my grievances. And I've learned that these antics serve to shut people up and uphold the status quo. So whatever, I'm going to go ahead and continue to say what I want to say. Obviously, it's always been a very important time to do that, and this is as important a time as ever. So in a nutshell, I was raised atheist from birth by immigrants from India. And my father is a scientist and a quite vocal atheist, and so I always valued science. I was also inherently a dark and terrified child, and I can say that sometimes while laughing at myself, but it's true. I was one of those atheist kids who desperately longed for gods and the afterlife and ghosts even to be real. And also I loved watching infomercials and shopping networks on TV, and I truly wanted all of their preposterous claims to be true. And I believed a lot of them. As a teenager in the late 90s, although I was aware peripherally of the skeptics movement, I was rather ambivalent about it. In the US, especially, skepticism is highly intertwined with atheism. And I was just starting to get past my phase of contempt for religious people. And I was fully over that phase by the age of 17 or so. So I was well ahead of some of those baby boomer atheists who clearly are still not over being full of themselves and their ostensibly gargantuan intellect. I kid a little bit. There are plenty of baby boomer atheists who I care for very much and respect very much. But in my 20s, given the heaps of privilege I was born with, and also some ongoing struggles with mental health since childhood, I'd sort of languished after college, and I worked a job that was fulfilling enough, but really without any real meaning, all while dwelling on a sort of existential dread. That all changed for me in 2011. That's when my daughter was born. And that's also when I developed a full-blown case of postpartum OCD. So for me, postpartum OCD was a barrage of constant waves of really explicit and vivid fear of something bad happening to my baby, and then constant compulsive actions to temporarily appease the terror. And I could spend a long time getting into that, and I have, and you can read about it if you're interested. But long story kind of short, combined with all of the spurious information in the parenting zeitgeist, the deep anxiety and fear debilitated me. And the pressure to breastfeed was also overwhelming. So I also became obsessed with my breastfeeding success, which I achieved with both of my babies, but I would later write extensively about the costs of that decision for me and millions of other parents. Now, it would be an understatement to say that I was overwhelmed. I lived this way for a few months, and I put my spouse through it too. And I really appreciate him for all of the support. But then I realized that this can't be right, the way that I was living, and I would later learn how very wrong so much of this was. So the skeptics were like a beacon out of the darkness for me. So I found the skeptics movement, and I spent the next 2 years digging out of the worst of mental illness and raising my daughter and reading everything I could to figure out how to do evidence-based parenting and also just evidence-based worldviews and living. So I would breastfeed my baby with one hand and hold my phone in the other hand, and I would read skeptical content. And then I started digging into peer-reviewed scientific literature to piece together how to figure out what to worry about as a parent, as a woman, and generally a person who was upset that I'd been sort of duped into living in a nebulous but constant state of fear. And it was heartbreaking to learn that people were being misled into being afraid that medicine and vaccines and like fruits and vegetables were going to hurt their kids. It was so sad to learn that parents were afraid and distrustful of doctors, which of course is for not unjustified reasons. But they were so afraid that some at high risk for complications would avoid beneficial and safe interventions, like testing for gestational diabetes or antibiotics for group B strep. And it was sad to learn that those at increased risk for postpartum psychiatric conditions would rather eat their own placenta than seek evidence-based psychiatric care. And so I became steeped in the science of everything from health to food, and soon I began to navigate my way through the spheres of parenting influence. So I wanted to help others out of their darknesses too. So my interest in science and love of writing came together as action. So I'd found solace in the skeptics movement, and I began blogging to counter the fear and myths that were so pervasive in the parenting world. I got into it because it had been such a challenge for me to figure out what was actually worth worrying about. Like I said, as a parent and a woman, but also as a child of immigrants, as a person who holds the values that I hold. And there was clearly a need to help others do the same, to figure out what to worry about in terms of safety, but also in regard to shared values. So in the first couple of years, I dove into parenting-related topics, and some of them are listed here: mental health, pregnancy and birth, infant feeding, food and agriculture, GMOs, of course, was a big one, chemicals, cancers, alternative medicine, and more. So by 2015, I had been an active writer for a couple of years when my relationship with the Center for Inquiry started. So I was drawn to the skeptics movement by its ethos of democratizing the pursuit of the bald-faced truth. So as I wrote in Undark, Carl Sagan didn't just give us cosmos. He also co-founded the organization now known as the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And in doing so, he helped launch the contemporary skeptics movement. And I say helped launch because I'm fully aware of the rich history of skeptics around the world, and skeptics had been doing what they were doing for decades before, depending on when we want to define the beginning of the global contemporary skeptics movement. But anyhow, what I valued, and as Sagan often put it, is that it was a movement that views science not just as a body of knowledge, but as a way of thinking. Now, a little bit about CSI, or the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. They published the Skeptical Inquirer, which is the magazine for science and reason. And it was founded in 1976 with a mission to, its current mission actually, is to promote scientific inquiry, critical investigation, and the use of reason in examining controversial and extraordinary claims. Okay. And the Center for Inquiry is the parent organization of CSI. It was founded in 1991 as an umbrella organization to bring together CSI, and the Council for Secular Humanism. Its current mission is that the Center for Inquiry strives to foster a secular society based on reason, science, freedom of inquiry, and humanist values. And its vision is a world in which evidence, science, and compassion, rather than superstition, pseudoscience, or prejudice, guide public policy. That all sounds good to me on its surface. They are a self-styled house of environment, and in 2016, CFI merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, bringing on Richard Dawkins as a board member and RDF's director as CFI's new CEO. And I'm certainly not the first to criticize CFI for its indifference to matters of race, diversity, and social justice. And as I wrote in my Undark essay, that indifference is reflected in its demographics. So prior to that essay, its 10-member board of directors included just one non-white person and 2 women. Now, what I'm sharing with you all today is as much a story about how some of us in the world of science, that includes public scientists and researchers, private sector scientists, writers, journalists, marketers, science advocate types, and skeptics. Why don't we call them science people for the purpose of my talk today? They or we have a trajectory that looks something like this. And if you're not someone who gets my humor, beware that this is a bit tongue-in-cheek and also self-deprecating, but nevertheless, it's not inaccurate. So the first part of that trajectory is that we're taught that science is infallible and apolitical. And then step 2, we rally a bit around this. Science doesn't care what you believe is a popular refrain, as is citation needed. Then step 3, those who really care about evidence-based worldviews are like, wait, science isn't apolitical. I was wrong. I was being scientific. Scientistic. What have I done? Now, plenty of people, I say, get stuck at step 1, almost ideologically stuck in some cases, and they never move past it. And some of them leave paths of ego-driven upheaval behind them, not only in scientific communities, but in the actual body of science. There are so many examples of this that I can't get into right now because I don't have enough time. But anyhow, in 2015, I was around a 1.1 on this trajectory. And as I would argue that they've shown in the past, CSI is among those still stuck around a 1 point something on this rough trajectory. And as I've gathered, they have a tendency to draw others at a 1 something stage into the fold. I have to apologize for this slide and for a handful of text-heavy slides today. You'll have to forgive me since I wrote this talk just for Skeptics in the Pub, and it's my first time sharing this story so extensively, so please bear with me. So in 2016, I spoke at my first SciCon. That's the annual conference that's been held in Las Vegas for the last several years, and some of you may have attended in the past. And that's when they began sort of pursuing me to start writing for Skeptical Inquirer. That year at SciCon in 2016 was also the first time that I brought the issue of lack of diversity to CSI's executive director. In fact, I sat down with him at the SciCon Halloween party in Las Vegas, and I told him that I was having a nice experience, but asked if I could please talk to him about the overwhelmingly beige and relatively elderly demographic. He seemed deflated about the whole thing and said that he tries and that he's been alerted to this before. And I explained that I was fully aware that this was the case, and I gently asked him to please try harder. Anyhow, by 2018, I'd come to the third step of that science is infallible trajectory. And I'm not sure that the leadership at CFI and CSI were aware of this evolution on my part, but that's also when I agreed to start writing a Skeptical Inquirer column. So shortly thereafter, the CSI executive director, ostensibly with the blessing of CFI's CEO, asked if I would be interested in hosting their podcast, Point of Inquiry. So at this point, I highly suspected that they thought I was still a one-something on that trajectory that I mentioned. And I was uneasy, but I decided to accept this gig because, for one, I hoped that they had learned something in the last many years of receiving pretty thorough criticism. And second, I figured that this gives me the opportunity to expose skeptics to issues that we really need exposure to. But that year at SciCon in October 2018, my heart absolutely sank at what had happened, which I'll explain in a moment. But I realized sort of that after all of these years of bringing these glaring problems to CFI and their leadership, they were still being almost aggressively ignorant. And at this point, I'd started writing for various outlets and speaking at events for other audiences. And I realized that given the privilege of being a financially secure freelancer on my spouse's health insurance, I was in the relatively safe position to start speaking out publicly. And so that's what I did. Oops. One moment. So a bit more detail about what went down that year in conversations with Richard Dawkins and Stephen Fry. So Stephen Fry was the recipient of the Richard Dawkins Award for that year. And really, it's beyond me why they allow unscripted nonsense from Dawkins. And I honestly wasn't surprised at what happened, though I was particularly disturbed. So anyway, I was sitting in the audience towards the back, and I was tired and not paying much attention because I was tired. I'd given a talk on the stage the previous day. I had recorded several Point of Inquiry interviews live from Vegas, and I was preparing to fly to Washington, D.C., straight from Las Vegas, to go to the big national annual conference of the nutrition and dietetics fields to give a presentation for a panel on clean eating. And clean eating is quite a complex thing. So I wasn't paying attention, long story short. But toward the end, after a long discussion between Fry and Dawkins on appreciating the art and culture of religion while still rejecting the supernatural aspect, Dawkins began talking about the regressive left. And whenever I hear someone earnestly say regressive left, I know that some bigoted posturing is highly likely to follow. So I'm going to go ahead and read a bit verbatim from the transcript of the conversation. So Dawkins begins. You said, Stephen, that the catastrophe of Trump and Brexit is less a triumph of the right than a failure of the left. Yes, Fry replies. Dawkins asks, do you recognize the phrase regressive left? Fry says, yes, I've come across it, yeah. So Dawkins kind of digs a little more. He says, do you have a view on that? And Fry, did he ever have a view? So he says, this is a little bit lengthy, but I'll read it. He says, there's a part of me that just wants to be mischievous and say, look, this Grand Canyon, and we were in Vegas, so we were near the Grand Canyon. He says, this Grand Canyon has opened up in America and really across the world, certainly around the developed world, the chattering world, if you like, and it's getting wider every day. therefore, people on each side of the divide, they have to shout louder and gesticulate more horribly to be heard by the other side. And they are not being heard by the other side. And they are just making noises and screaming and hating each other deeply and thinking the other vile and destructive and inhuman. And I like to think of myself, Fry says, I like to think of myself and right-thinking people as cowering in the ravine at the bottom, unsure what to do. Because on the one hand, you have a nativist alt-right bringing up all kinds of nasty, unacceptable, and horrifying racist thoughts and divisions, but you also have a preposterous, illiberal, liberal left shouting out these jargonistic nonsense from the university. And now, by this time, at least in my view, his voice is dripping with ridicule or maybe contempt. And he says, if I have to hear about the patriarchy and cisgender white privilege, blah, 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 and he starts waving his hands as if in disgust, excuse me. And so that's when I walked out the door and tweeted my views. Now, I had initially heard that I initially heard him say cis het privilege, but later looking back at the video and the transcript, what he said was cis white privilege. But either way, that's when I walked out the door and tweeted my views, because clearly cis het privilege and white privilege, as well as the patriarchy, whatever you want to call them, are very data and evidence-clad phenomena. So, as I mentioned in the previous timeline slide, I requested, I requested a call with CFI CEO and CSI's executive director. And that phone call exposed so much more of the underbelly than I had already seen. It was quite a long call, around an hour. And I'll describe a couple bits of it, and I'm going to paraphrase. But the CEO on the call suggested that people cannot talk about social justice, especially race and racism, without getting too emotional. And she definitely said too emotional, and this is kind of something that she likes to say. She's quite a outspoken person, so I will allow you to do your own reading on her views. So, okay, she tells me that people can't talk about race without getting too emotional, which I didn't understand why she was so vehemently, almost angry about this emotion about race. So I decided I was going to be constructive. So I made a few suggestions that I thought that CFI and CSI should take seriously. And one of those suggestions was for CSI and CFI to invite a speaker every year to SciCon from a formerly colonized country. And the CEO seemed very confused and asked me to clarify what I meant by a formerly colonized country. And so I explained, formerly colonized countries, and I began naming some of them. And she interrupted me to suggest that this wasn't a good idea because CFI shouldn't give their platform to people to air their grievances. And she said, air their grievances. And so I was really taken aback. And I said, listen, what I meant was that you invite people from formerly colonized countries, known for their contributions to science or skepticism or secularism. And you ask them to talk about their area of expertise. But anyhow, it was an unnerving conversation. So the rest of the timeline, I promise this will be the last very text-heavy slide. But after that, I had a few conversations with respected and trusted colleagues and decided how to proceed, because I got the idea from the call that she expected me to sort of toe the party line going forward. And I didn't really have any intention of doing that. But I continued writing my column and decided to go ahead and host Point of Inquiry. And I continued calling out bad behavior. And then in 2019, the sense that I was being tokenized reached a breaking point. I spoke at my final SciCon that year, and remarks that Dawkins made on stage that year about how he couldn't possibly be stoking racist Islamophobia because, as his logic goes, as his reasoning goes, Islamophobia isn't a thing, and criticizing Islam can never be racist because Islam is not a race. It's just completely nonsensical, and I can say that from experience as someone who I have many Muslim friends, but I've never been Muslim a day in my life. Yet somehow I get Islamophobic comments from people just walking around, especially in the aughts, but it still happens. So clearly his reasoning is just, it's not sound. I don't understand the respect for this person. But I was left physically shaking because it's quite disturbing to me to see someone make remarks on that stage in this way. So anyhow, in October 2019, I received the letter from CFI parting ways with me. And by February 2020, Undark had published my essay, The Skeptics Movement Can't Afford to Ignore Racial Inequality. And so days later, all of my writing and podcast episodes were removed from the website. In April, they began receiving complaints from, it seems, prominent enough skeptics about this erasure. So in an attempt, I think, to appease those who complained, they restored my work. But they began circulating a webpage memo and what seemed like an attempt to denigrate me. So now we will get to the part that I promised, the lessons. What can we learn as skeptics about white supremacy from all of this? So now I hope I've set the scene, and we'll get to the real meat of what CSI can teach us. But none of these lessons are new, and I'm only conveying them through my lens of experience. And they are new, I guess, in the sense that many people in the skeptics community haven't learned them. So the first lesson, white supremacy is not its caricature. Ibram X. Kendi is an American author, historian, and a scholar of race and discriminatory policy in the US. And he often says the heartbeat of racism is denial, and the sound of that heartbeat is I'm not racist. So this caricature of white supremacy and white supremacists as a MAGA hat wearing, tiki torch wielding, swastika sporting sort of redneck, it serves the status quo. You see how these two people, children, I guess, walking, say, ever notice how white supremacists are their own counterargument? And I understand the humor in this, but it allows those who see ourselves as intelligent and good and reasonable people to remove ourselves from the picture and from becoming part of the solution. So white supremacy is a system, and white supremacists are simply those who uphold that system. So if you remove the notion that people who are reasonable, good people, and not racist have nothing to do with white supremacy, and begin to see white supremacy for what it is, which is a system that elevates whiteness for no other reason than elevating whiteness, and the history of that, then we can begin to explore how well-intentioned people who consider themselves good and not racist nevertheless uphold the status quo. So that's when it becomes clear that there is no such thing as not racist. There is only anti-racist or racist. So that's right, staying out of the racist category, it takes a little bit of work. And I'm certainly not here to pass judgment on anyone who hasn't yet done that work. When you know better, you do better after all. I love that GIF, the more you know. It's a very quintessential American thing. But I do say that anyone claiming to be a skeptic who hasn't done that learning should go ahead and get to it. And now here you see on the slide the flyer from 2016. At the time, I had an uneasy feeling that I was being tokenized, and that feeling would later crystallize to unavoidable, blatant tokenization. Now, this also brings to mind the problem with colorblind philanthropy. There's been a lot of solid critique of philanthropy and nonprofits, and among that is this critique of colorblind philanthropy. So last September, CFI announced that the newest member of its board, at that time the 10th member, would be yet another white person. I have nothing against this person, but as one board member later conveyed, it seems that they didn't do an active search for a 10th board member, but they brought this person on because someone had lobbied for her addition. So I was disappointed, and I reached out to one board member whom I'd regularly interacted with. And this was via Facebook Messenger. And I asked him, "You elected another white person to the board? Really?" And his reply was, "Yep. Finding people that want to serve on the board and have the appropriate qualifications isn't easy." So that's why I wrote in Undark that him dismissing the board's overwhelming whiteness as a function of qualifications is far easier than grappling with their race problem. But the most disturbing truths aren't supposed to be easy to contend with. And I really have no reservations in saying that this is the kind of not racist crap that upholds white supremacy. So that leads me to my next lesson, which is impatience is a totally irrational approach to white supremacy. As I explained in Undark, CFI's 2019 merger with the charitable foundation led by Dawkins, RDF, he repeatedly has come under fire for Islamophobic and misogynistic remarks, which did little to burnish its reputation. And further, as author Sikivu Hutchinson put in a 2018 essay about the merger, quote, "CFI's all-white board looks right at home with the Dawkins Foundation's lily white board and staff." So another board member who I approached about this decision wrote to me, "Adding board members isn't a competition. It's a process, usually a slow one, and making progress on diversity is a good thing, even if the diversity is not in the particular dimension you want." Ostensibly, he was talking about the fact that this person is a woman. Now, I won't go through all of the text on this slide here, but I decided to juxtapose what he said with Martin Luther King's comments on timing and patience and waiting. "This wait has almost always meant never," he wrote. And so this cartoon here is also a good one based on a post called "How to Ally" by an influencer known as Waste Free Marie. And I also really liked this illustration, so I included it in the slide there for you. But since we're running a little low on time, I'll go to the next lesson, which is that religion is not the primary driver of white supremacy. It's the purveyors of so-called reason and rationality and science. I observed this clearly from the people in leadership at CFI and CSI. And again, these are among the most visible skeptical and humanist organizations in America. And they seem to truly and genuinely believe that they are the ones in possession of reason and science. But their intentions aside, they've effectively tried their utmost to deflect blame for the atrocities of racism, all while upholding their own literal white supremacy among their ranks. I don't know how else to put it. And this isn't, of course, just an issue with CFI and CSI. I quote Angela Saini here in this slide from The Return of Race Science, from the prologue. And this statement really struck me. She writes, throughout, white thinkers told us that their culture was better, that they were the proprietors of thought and reason, and they married this with the notion that they belonged to superior races. These became our realities. The truth is something else. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to interview Angela about Superior for Point of Inquiry. So I've included that in a link in the slide as well. And now this image on the right of this slide of Hitler and the Crusades, this imagery here, bless the heart of the person who put together this graphic and quotes himself from a book that he wrote. This person is a sort of well-known secular and skeptical activist in the U.S., and he also has founded a political party. But anyhow, he had posted this on Facebook about how kind of suggesting that that white supremacy comes from religion and religion is to blame. And so I actually explained to him how this was problematic, and he's going to be doing some reading, so that's great. The next lesson is that social justice has everything to do with science. So there's this pervasive idea in the skeptics movement that social justice is political and science is apolitical, and thus social science doesn't have anything to do with science, and that's not true. The endeavor of science has always been a product of the people who do it, and that has historically been white men, and this has had gargantuan influence to this day, as I know that many of you in the audience are already aware. But anyone purporting to care about scientific inquiry, critical investigation, and the use of reason in examining controversial and extraordinary claims must orient themselves around social justice. And yet, another lesson, the caricature of the blithering SJW is a straw man, which I think has been concocted by status quo warriors. Like when I write about the problem with the patriarchy leading to a lack of informed choice for mode of birth for birthing women, for example, birthing people, which is leading to issues with our pelvic floors, that's not me gratuitously talking about my vagina and the vaginas of all the other birthing people experiencing injustice. I really did write about that, by the way. Some of you may have read the reported essay I wrote for Self magazine. It is called Giving Birth Made Me Question the Informed Consent Process During Childbirth. Or when someone like me says trans Black Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter, it's not just SJW fluff buzzwords. It's based on real, actual data and science. And I would like to add, and Alice supports me on this, that I will always and forever talk about my vagina. It has not only survived what it's been through, I have to say it has thrived. And for fans of the movie 13 going on 30, there might be one or two. You'll have to let me know. But for you, I will even say that my vagina is 37, flirty-7, and thriving. I had to tell you this. So anyone who claims to be a skeptic ought to discard the notion that people who care about social justice are driven by irrational emotion and unreason. Now, another lesson is that lip service to racism does not, again, render an entity not racist. So this issue of Skeptical Inquirer that you've seen on the slides here a couple times was a special issue that was published about 2 years ago. And as I wrote, it was published in an inept address to address race. The issue, penned exclusively by white men, note, demonstrated CFI leadership's woefully shallow grasp of how racism works. In an article on critical thinking approaches to confronting racism, the magazine's deputy editor referenced the view of evolutionary psychologist and author Steven Pinker, that the overall historical trends for humanity are encouraging. And that's a view that's been criticized as glossing over the plights of the most marginalized people. The deputy editor's contribution to the special issue also seemed to ignore the elephant in CFI's room. He made not even a passing mention of the staggering racial disparities within his own organization and within the very pages of the publication he was writing for. And I'm not saying that the issue was all trash. I mean, there were some interesting bits in it, but I would say the one piece with any valuable depth and that featured the perspective of a non-white researcher was by a white author named Sam Scott, who did an interview with Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a psychologist and researcher studying racial bias at Stanford. And a side note, the funny thing was that by all measures, it seems as if this piece was passed off as reported and written for this Skeptical Inquirer issue, whereas it had actually been published in Stanford Magazine in 2015. But anyway, moving on, yeah, cool. Go ahead and use a stock photo of a Black person for your cover, as if you actually care what Black people say. Another lesson is that erasure, hypocrisy, and demonizing the messenger are quintessential reactions to those who confront white supremacy and who confront other unequal power structures. For 4 years, I was CFI's most public-facing non-white associate among a mere handful or less of non-white people who worked for or with CFI. And as I said earlier, days after after Undark ran my essay, CFI retaliated by removing all of my work from its website. So the hypocrisy in this situation is that CFI and CSI's leadership, especially the CEO, like to call themselves free speech purists. And they say this on a regular basis. The deleted content included articles on quack autism cures, spurious birth practices, infant feeding, alternative medicine, pesticides, and podcast interviews on everything from MSG to OCD to the resurgence of race science. So soon CFI began receiving complaints about this erasure. So in an apparent attempt to appease those who complained, they restored my work, which was great. And that could have been the end of it and should have been the end of it. But then they also began circulating this webpage memo on a dangling link that you have to have the URL to in order to see. And And they circulated this in a seeming attempt to denigrate me and to do their very best to explain how not racist they are. So in this memo, they quote extensively from my own postings as if my words are evidence of how irresponsible I am to criticize them. And really, the quotes sort of speak for themselves. Like, for instance, in this appendix, they quote from some of my work and social media postings. So one piece of evidence purportedly about how nobody should listen to Kavin reads, March 20th, 2020, I wrote, referring to CFI, quoting me, the textbook institutional white supremacy is almost surreal. Well, yeah, I did write that, and now I'm giving an entire Skeptics in the Pub talk about it. So I just, what's your point? I have asked them what the point is, by the way, and they haven't told me, which I think is quite rude. So I won't go through this whole strange memo right now, but you can read about it in the blog linked in this slide. So like I said, I didn't ask to be part of this narrative. But another lesson that really is just a universal lesson from everybody is that actions are more important than words. So in this memo, again, about me, they say that my public denunciations of CFI and its leaders, borne out by comments appended to the letter, defy all evidence to the contrary. CFI values and practices are in fact consistent with our mission. They oppose white supremacy, they say. They've used their platform to expose fallacies and dangers of racial prejudice, and that they're committed to diversity. They also write that they already work alongside a vast array of paid professional and lay leaders of all races and ethnicities. Just don't call your so-called diversity a vast array. I mean, I don't know. But anyhow, I can unequivocally share with you all that the Center for Inquiry Leadership have rejected multiple generous and well-referenced attempts to convince them to take the basic step of adopting a formal diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. I actually read one such thorough proposal that Fed Up staff earnestly put together, and it was quite extensive. But evidently, this would be part of the so-called mission creep that they bandy about as a flimsy excuse, really. So if racism is among the most pressing pseudoscientific threats of our time, which it is, and if CSI cares about pseudoscience, which they claim to, then what's going on? Well, as much as folks like me had hoped that its leadership would pull its head out of the sand after all these years, they haven't started walking the talk. Even after Black Lives Matter has become a mainstream international revolution, which I think by all measures is moving into the Overton window, if not solidly there, and institutions left and right, including scientific and secular organizations, are adopting policy to center equity and inclusion. All CFI issued was a sort of lukewarm statement in which they write that the Center for Inquiry categorically opposes abusive policing and racism, supports the position that Black Lives Matter, and finds that ongoing attempts to dehumanize African Americans demonstrates that society is still mired in a most unfortunate state of intellectual and moral infancy. Well, I think that this perhaps most visible humanist and skeptical organization in America should have a look at its own unfortunate state of intellectual and moral infancy. So I had a look at the CFI website and recent issues of Skeptical Inquirer, and nope, they haven't seemed to have had that look in the mirror as of a couple days ago. So there are a few compelling pieces here and there for sure, but it's mostly more of the usual ghosts and debunkery and low-hanging skeptical fruit. So one piece in particular struck me as glaringly bad It's by a longtime white male CFI associate and research fellow. And this piece is called, I kid you not, Can I oppose waterboarding if I've never been waterboarded? Yeah, that's what it's called. And I mean, I've never been waterboarded, and I oppose waterboarding myself. But it just isn't a sound analogy for almost anything else. Alas, this piece goes ahead and tries. So I'll read a short excerpt. I'm wrapping up, I promise. Similar reasoning applies to the contention that some issues should be reserved for authors from certain groups. There are few living authors who have been slaves themselves, and historically, slavery has been experienced by every human ethnic group at one time or another. Slavery is part of our universal human heritage. The second context, where there's a discussion about various harms disproportionately endured by minority or marginalized groups, and the measures needed to address these harms. Here, the mantra for the past decade at least has been shut up and listen, with this instruction usually being directed to white males or white males. So clearly, this white man feels very victimized at not being able to write about police brutality. It's very nice of CFI to provide a safe space for him. So one of the last lessons is that diversity without inclusion is exclusion. This tweet really encompasses the problem with institutions across America and globally, and that's what's been happening at CSI and CFI. Granted, after years of work by others to push them in the right direction, and directly following my most recent criticisms, they added a couple more non-white board members, which is great. But I see no evidence that they've sought authentic direction from those members. In other words, they've done this to enhance the boutique experience of white members. Interrogating and grappling with mistakes is necessary for all institutions and individuals. So white people globally are having a film removed from their eyes, or people in general, not just white people. Or so this narrative has been going since BLM became a mainstream international movement. But I mean, it's great that Tina Fey is pulling episodes of 30 Rock in which characters appear in blackface. But still, white people suddenly seeing Black people as human is not good. Like, Tina Fey had to have known earlier. And then this other is a screenshot from a statement from a real estate company that the realtor who helped us buy our home many years ago works for this company. And they themselves are saying that real estate has played an insidious role in institutionalized racism and needs reform. So Ibram X. Kendi says that the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession. And there's nothing self-flagellating about making confessions when we're wrong. All of us should confess to ourselves, at the very least, to our peers, about our learning experiences so others may do the same. I mean, one of my confessions is that I, several years ago, didn't understand why TERFs were totally just wrong. For those of you who aren't aware of the term TERF, it's TERF. It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. The new term is FART. That stands for Feminist Appropriating Radical Transphobes. And but I learned, and I should tell you, I'm actually related by marriage to one of the most famous TERFs in the world. Actually famous farts, and it's not J.K. Rowling. But anyhow, I'm going to skip this lesson about skeptical pedantry. Maybe I'll bring it up during the Zoom conference, but I'd like to move right along to the final lesson, and that is that skeptics need to center social justice if we're ever going to combat misinformation. when it comes to the issues that we care about. So as I wrote on Dark, I still believe that the skeptics movement can be a force against white supremacy. And that questions pertaining to race shouldn't be an exception to the rules that we normally hold ourselves to. If skeptics refuse to contextualize issues in terms of race and other demographics, it will only hinder our efforts to address other forms of pseudoscience. So to wrap up, I was drawn to the skeptics movement because I liked the idea of democratizing the pursuit of the bald-faced truth. And I wanted to know what I need to worry about as a parent, as a woman, but also as a daughter of immigrants, as someone who values equality and the scientific method. So now when we center the fact that race is pseudoscientific and a social construct, and center the fact that people of color and Black people in particular in America deal with race-based discrimination across all of society, from higher infant and maternal mortality rates to subpar treatment by doctors and educators and housing authorities, all the way to policing. We need to center this. So I do still have a lot of hope for the skeptics movement. That's why I'm here today, imploring you all to listen and to learn. And if you're white, to please collect the so-called not racist skeptics and do the work to expose them to, well, the bald-faced truth. So thank you. That's the presentation for today.
Thank you, Kavin. Wasn't that a great talk? Let us know what you thought in the chat box. We're going to take a short break now, but before we do, don't forget to ask your questions and upvote the ones you like at sly.do/Kavin. If you want to donate to our PayPal, our mods should be sharing the link for you right now, and we will see you back here at 8:15. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. And if you'd like to welcome back Kavin Senapathy back to your screens, and we'll start going through some of the questions that we've had through at sly.do/Kavin. Don't forget, you can continue asking your questions there, continue upvoting, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the next little space of time. So we'll start off with the question from David Drummer, who asked, what are the first steps you suggest for someone who wants to examine their own position with regard to racism issues?
That's a hard question. It took me a few years, I would think, to really thoroughly examine my own position with regard to not only racism issues, but gender discrimination and so many other things. So I would suggest going with the form of media that sort of speaks to you. Just make sure it's evidence-based stuff. And since I'm talking to mostly a skeptical audience, I think I hope that you know what I mean. One thing that comes to mind for Americans who are on the or at Skeptics in the Pub today, or maybe even global folks, is there's this music video that I really like that just came out. It's by the Chicks, formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, and they changed their name because of the connection of the word Dixie with the Confederate States. And the video is called March, March, and it's just a gripping and powerful video. And at the end, they and also in the video notes on YouTube, they include quite a few resources on how to start in your journey with anti-racism, and they're all pretty sound. I did take a look at those, so do watch the video by the Chicks.
Okay, so the next question we have is from Dave, who asked, having spoken at both UK and American conferences, what do you see as the biggest differences?
So I think he means UK and American skeptic conferences. And I've also spoken at the European Council of Skeptical Organizations conference, which was in Ghent, Belgium, recently. Has it been a couple of years now? Okay, anyway. I believe that American conferences, SciCon in particular, they tend to have more of a sort of hierarchy or celebrity. They overvalue celebrity in the skeptics movement, so there kind of becomes this rift between so-called VIPs and just us regular skeptics. And I think that UK conferences, especially QED, which is the cream of the skeptical conference crop, does that really well, brings people together and really makes it an environment where rich and open discourse can happen while remaining respectful and kind. Now, I can't speak for all American skeptical conferences. I haven't been to Nexus. I will say that Skepticon is a lovely American conference, and the registration is also free. And I've spoken at Skepticon, and I thought that was also a wonderful environment.
Excellent. So we have an anonymous question who, and they asked, how do we combat the idea, particularly among the skeptic community, that social sciences are not real science?
Well, I mean, this is a huge question and matter of conversation, of course, among skeptics. So I certainly don't purport to have that answer because it's still an idea that has to be combated, which I wish it didn't have to be combated. But the short answer is really like, stop saying that. That's about it.
No, it definitely seems to be the case that skeptics are prone to looking down on some things, and social sciences might be one of those things that we could do a bit better at. Marianne asked, what do you think are useful methods for white people trying to be anti-racist to support people speaking up about racism in these organizations, for example, letters or public action?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization. It depends on the leader, kind of which generation, I suppose, the leadership is from. So CFI and CSI, for their part, they don't tend to pay attention to Twitter, but I still think Twitter is useful for raising awareness about these issues. They seem to pay a little more attention to Facebook, but direct emails and letters are meaningful, and public action to the point where it also spurs people to write letters and speak up directly to the leadership, whether it be I think letter to the board of directors, for example, are within perfectly reasonable courses of action to take with this organization. But I think other useful methods, especially in the skeptical movement, is to kind of stop giving the benefit of the doubt to bad faith views, bad faith arguments, and sea lions. And if you don't know what sea lions are, you can look it up and you'll find out.
I'm sure some of our mods will be able to share a link in the chat if people are interested in the definition. Cool. So Matt asked, given your experiences, if you could start again, would you join CSI again? And if so, would you do anything differently within the organization?
Given what I know now, I mean, I guess I can't. What I've gone through, I've already gone through. I guess I certainly would not join again if asked, if somehow they claimed that they were sorry and they would really value my input about pseudoscience and things, because I did quite good work for them, and I think they have a few gaps in that regard. But I wouldn't join CSI again now, barring some sort of very unlikely actions. But if I could start again, I would join CSI again, back when I did, because as I said, I am now able to say that I spent a few years doing my very best and kind of exercising my privilege and using my energy to try to push them in the right direction. Now, of course, some of that was not necessarily productive, but I think the ultimate outcome is still a good thing. I I I have several relationships with people that I respect a whole lot who are still with CSI and CFI, and some who have moved on. And I really value those, and I think that these relationships will continue. So I'm glad for that.
Okay, we've got a question from Gerald who asks, subjects of interest to you in your role as a mother drew you to skepticism. Should skeptical organisations try to reach more women by occupying these subjects? Do you think maybe we don't do a good enough job at that?
Well, I think some skeptical organizations do really well at reaching parents in general. Again, QED comes to mind because at QED you can bring your kids and they have I'm forgetting the word that you use there for the little like a daycare. Yeah, the creche. So American of me to forget. But I think those kinds of accessibility things for parents are very, very important. But I think skeptical organizations would reach not only women, but more young people, more people from all different kinds of backgrounds. If we just came one step out from kind of our skeptical bubble of how we think about things. And I think Claire Klingenberg put this well in a podcast interview I did with her for Point of Inquiry. And I got to paraphrase here, but we're all not mean. So if we just started, acting like regular people and not hiding things that are maybe guilty pleasures about us, sometimes I eat organic, sometimes I've been using a CBD ointment, even though I know it's a total placebo effect, but whatever. We can't be skeptical about everything all the time. And that's okay. It's a goal that we set for ourselves at times. I don't know, I'm rambling here, but I think you get the point.
Try and be a bit more human and try and reach people on the level that they're at, that we're all fallible, we all make mistakes, we all like what we like, whether it's evidence-based or not sometimes.
I think it should be less, again, bringing more women and more people and younger people into the fold. It should be less about looking up to leaders of any sort or people that we somehow assume are infallible, and really think about being a community and keeping each other in check, and being okay with that.
So we've got a question from William who asked, what suggestions would you offer to boards of SciComm or skeptical organisations who've struggled to find diverse recruits who are willing and enthusiastic to join?
Well, I'm not an expert in this whatsoever in terms of how to actually draw diverse members and associates. But for one, don't have Richard Dawkins on your stage. As much as you think he is very cool, he's not. But really, I think that boards of organizations that have the resources should really budget for expertise on how to center anti-racism, how to center anti-other kinds of bigotry, and how to really create change from within and not just make surface level statements that you're not going to follow through with.
Which that, I guess, talks to big organizations like CSI and CFI, but
yeah, right.
For the
organizations like ours, like Psy Moms or something that I do, or skeptical organizations, do your best to make space for diversity, and really try to, I think, what am I trying to say? Make space for diversity, but also just kind of enable people as much as possible. Like, we all skeptics often have so much going on, and a lot of skeptics do what they do, their outreach, as volunteers, and so it really needs to be an attractive proposition to put in that kind of work.
Cool. So Dale asked, how do you approach those who respond to those who take action and speak out by making accusations of them being a troublemaker, irrational, or even extremist? And I think you touched on this a little bit by saying you've been told that people talking about race might be a bit too emotional or problematic in some way.
Well, I think it's a great question, but I think this question itself sort of touches the surface of latent phenomena, right? So every time there's somebody like me, like I said, I had almost calculated that I would be safe in speaking out in these ways, in terms of my own livelihood and my own family. But for every person like me who does take action and does speak out by making and they make accusations of them being a troublemaker or irrational or extremist, there are a slew of other people who are not in positions to speak up publicly and who are probably doing just as much, and if not more, real work to create change. And so I think that people like, for example, Skeptics in the Pub, showing someone like me support and giving me space to explain the lessons that I've learned, I hope can go a long way in motivating everyone else who's really doing the hard work and what they need to do, and in also making them feel that maybe, perhaps, there is a net that will catch them.
Excellent. And I think, the last couple of questions you've touched on, the most important thing seems to be diversity. If you can represent as many different types of people as possible, then you're doing something good in trying to help people either speak out, feel supported, or just see their face, somebody who represents them and feel like they're part of this community that we're all part of. Annika asked, what can the skeptical movement as a whole do to improve? What would you recommend as the first steps and then the further steps?
What can I'm looking at the question. What would be the first steps? There are so many people in the skeptical movement doing good work, and I'm not saying to look up to them as heroes, but to perhaps learn from them and listen to their advice. So one example, again, a little bit of self-promotion, is to listen to the Point of Inquiry episode in which I interview Claire Klingenberg. We actually talked about a few steps that people can take, but one of the big ones is to just start to understand that skepticism isn't apolitical, and I mentioned this a couple of times, as much as you want it to be. And so once we start realizing that, we start realizing that really almost anything, any issue or any question is within the purview of skeptical inquiry, and there's nothing that should sort of be siloed out of it. So I believe that expanding our view in that regard would be a good general step.
Okay, we've got a question from Paul who says, I know correlation isn't necessarily causation, but did the current problems you identify in CFI come to light after the merger with the Richard Dawkins Foundation?
I'm not sure what you mean by come to light, if you mean in terms of come to light publicly. But there have been problems before the merger with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, but I think certainly that merger catalyzed some of those problems bubbling to the surface.
And Andrew asks, could you explain the differences between those 3 stages that you talked about? They didn't fully understand what it means to move through the different stages and why we would want to move through those different stages.
Yeah. Actually, again, I'm so sorry for referring people to my work, but I hate kind of reinventing those wheels. So I talk a little bit about them in my interview with 2 of the scientists from Science for the People. You can also find that on the Point of Inquiry website. But if I have a moment, let me just go back to that slide and I'll kind of touch on it for a second. The 3, yes. So if you recall that slide, there is a cartoon of me with a sword that says science. And so the first step is this idea that science is infallible, that it is completely objective. And even though in some sort of corner of my mind or the mind of people, I think, who generally get into the science world, you are trained to have a whole lot of confidence in what science tells us. But the more science you read throughout the history of any given field of science, the more you realize that, oh my God, there's so much of the individuals, the researchers who did this work, like you read it in their writing, like they're just, some of it is just opining and best guesses based on their own perspectives. So once you realize this, then that's when you start understanding how the body of scientific literature, as well as a scientific community, are affected by these very human impulses. So one really good example, at least one that I like, if I have time, it's 1 second. I jotted it down in case this question came up.
It's the opportunity to have a sip of my wine.
A sip? I have wine too. I might have a sip. Yes. So I learned about this when I was working on an assignment about why women or there's also research on non-binary people, but why women have much higher incidence of autoimmune disease, which is a fact. So the Nobel winner and immunologist Paul Ehrlich, he actually ended up kind of delaying the study of autoimmunity by about 30 years because of what some people call Nobel disease. So he coined this term called horror autotoxicus. And this term was basically meant to encompass the idea that it is unthinkably terrifying and horrible that one's own immune system would turn on their own body and would turn on their own tissues. So he was so sure that the human body's immune system wouldn't turn on itself that he and the field of immunology actually rejected the idea that autoimmunity was real, even as evidence to the contrary was coming out. So this is one example of how, like, okay, this is how science actually works. And I mean, this is quite a fascinating and disturbing example when you think about like the current study of immunity and how maybe it would be helpful if we had 30 more years on it. But anyhow, there are science is full of this. So that's at least how the evolution through these 3 steps has sort of worked for me. But it's very complicated. So please do listen to the episode if you like podcasts.
So we've got a question from Simon who asked, and I think we've touched on this a little bit already, do you have any suggestions for organisations that aren't culturally diverse on how to be welcoming? As it's clearly hard on the initial recruits if they have to fix it, if you're responsible then for fixing it. And I guess you must feel this a little bit sometimes yourself, if you're, especially with CFI and CSI, saying, I'm the only person of colour that you're working with, and it's on me to challenge you on this. That must be quite challenging.
It was. I don't like using the word crazy, but it's almost crazy making. It's gaslighting to some effect, and I really don't think that that's too extreme to say. I mean, just listen to people, acknowledge that they're giving you the opportunity. Really, I think I was quite generous, and I really gave them quite a bit of solid information and quite constructive suggestions. So if you're not going to do that, then yeah, your membership is going to look overwhelmingly beige and older.
So we said earlier, if you can try and enhance diversity in what you're representing. So for Skeptics in the Pub organisations, I guess that's booking speakers who are from a diverse range of backgrounds. You're going to make people feel more welcome just by seeing representation on your stages, for example. And then once you start getting people through into your membership, you can support them and listen to them and let them find their own voice and not gaslight them, I guess, as you say.
Right. It's been very helpful to have really hundreds of people come to me and say, like, listen, what you're saying is totally legitimate. And that's helpful because, living as a brown person in America, especially a kid of immigrants for my whole life, like, you kind of stop realizing, or you become accustomed to having to educate people about your own humanity and the humanity of the people you love. And yeah, like, I decided that I'm not going to be used to that anymore. So I'm still going to do it, but I'm also going to point out that it's BS that I have to do it.
We have an anonymous question who asked how CSI and CFI are funded. I think they're a non-profit, right?
Yeah. They're CFI is a nonprofit, and it's the parent organization of CSI and the Council for Secular Humanism. So they're funded primarily by donations. They do have quite a large budget for a nonprofit. I think it's in a handful of millions of dollars per year. So it's not industry funded or anything, if that's what you were getting at.
We have another anonymous question who said there's a lot of emotion behind words like racist and white supremacy. Are they essential to the conversation despite or even because of the emotion that they evoke? And I think this links in with another question that asked, is white supremacy quite a strong claim to use in this particular case? And maybe we could talk a bit about the definitions of those words and how they've developed over time and changed over time.
Right. So there's quite a bit of scholarship on this, but if you recall the slide in which I talk about the caricature, looking for that, the caricature of the white supremacist, that caricature is certainly how that word was used for so long and still is in many ways. But I don't think that, I'm looking at the question again, are they essential to the conversation despite or even because of the emotion they evoke? I mean, as so many skeptics say, not that I agree with this, I think that emotion is an acceptable thing for us to go through when we address things that are hard for us to come to terms with. And so our emotion is never a reason to remove certain words from our terminology. It is up to us to understand them and to deal with our emotions.
Okay, so I think we'll make this our last question, but Claire Klingenberg, who you've mentioned a couple of times today, she asked, can science in the current climate, pun both intended and not, ever be apolitical?
Hey, it's Claire, my eulogy buddy. We'll tell you that story sometime. I'm sure you'll hear it next time you hang out with Claire. Can science in the current climate ever be apolitical? I think no, it can't be apolitical. It isn't apolitical, and I really believe that the push or the struggle for some people in the science world to hang on to this notion that science is apolitical is counterproductive. Again, you can hear more about that in the Science for the People interview and in my interview with Claire.
Fantastic. So I think we'll wrap up there. Please join me again in thanking Kavin for an excellent, interesting and challenging talk. Just a reminder that you can donate to our PayPal if you're enjoying our events. You can find us on Facebook as Skeptics in the Pub online. And if you're ready to join us for a chat and a drink, follow the Zoom link to the lock-ins razor in the chat. Otherwise, we'll see you next week for a talk on Mormonism and eugenics from Bryce Blankenagel. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.